speak, can I also mention that one of the best ways you can support such discussions and ventures is joining Stop the War Coalition on our website or Facebook page, so that we can continue doing just this kind of discourse globally through Zoom sessions as today. Now, coming to our theme, Cut War, Not Healthcare. Our first speaker is the General Secretary of Cnd. She's been active in the peace movement nationally and internationally, and an author of a number of books, including Cnd at 60. Kate Hudson. Kate.
Thanks very much, Murad, and thanks for organising this very timely discussion. You couldn't have a sharper contrast, really, between the spending on healthcare and the necessary means to combat the pandemic and the crazy amounts of spending that we're seeing on military and, of course, on nuclear weapons as well. There was a very good article on Thursday in the Financial Times by David Pilling, the writer, and he was talking about the development of a vaccine, and when the vaccine comes on stream, how it should be treated as a global public good, that it can't be like a kind of health lottery or based on the ability to pay, where wealthy countries get big stocks and others don't. And he talked about how much it would cost to provide a vaccine for everyone on Earth. And health experts estimate that it would cost around $20 billion. So in global terms, that's nothing very much. That's you know, just a matter of a small number of days of GDP. So how does that compare with health spending? You know, with how does that vaccine health spending compare with military spending? Well, in terms of UK military spending, that $20 billion, that's about 40% of our annual defence budget. Our current annual defence budget is over £41 billion. So it's a fraction, it's a minority of just the UK's military spending. When you compare it globally, it just is completely just disproportionate figures. Global military spending is currently on $1.82 trillion a year. 1.82 trillion a year. That is the equivalent to $239 per person every day. So that's the kind of disproportionate spending we're seeing. Now, when you come on to looking at spending on nuclear weapons, the cost of a vaccine is dwarfed into insignificance just by US spending alone. So every year for the next 20 to 30 years, the US is planning to spend $75 billion on nuclear weapons. And when you take into account not only the UK spending, but other nuclear spending across the world, global spending on nukes may be up to twice that US figure. So exponential growth in spending on nuclear weapons. So what about the situation here in Britain then? We've seen massive cuts in the health service over the last 10 years. 4 years ago, the UK Parliament agreed to spend $205 billion on replacing our nuclear weapons system Trident. So that's the kind of priorities that the government has, spending vast amounts on nuclear weapons, which they always say we have in order not to use, but at the same time slashing and cutting the NHS. So it's been left unequipped to deal with the pandemic. Now, in a certain sense, if no one had expected a pandemic, okay, you might think, well, they didn't think we'd need to prepare for one, so we're not going to, well, they weren't spending the money on it. If you look at national security strategies and risk assessments over the last decade or more, you can see that they were very well aware that a pandemic was a huge risk. And going back as far as 2005, Tony Blair's national security strategy at that time, he said, it said, the World Health Organization has recognized the UK as being in the vanguard in preparing for a pandemic. Well, did we know that? And the UK was committed to making sure that, quotes, effective planning is in place at regional and local levels across the country. Well, if that was happening, it must have kind of fallen by the wayside, because it doesn't appear to have happened since. But it's not just Blair's government that had its sights on dealing with that as a massive public health emergency. In 2010, the coalition government, we all associate it very strongly with austerity cuts, but in its national security strategy, it also identified a natural hazard like an influenza pandemic, for example, as a tier 1 risk to our security. You know, not just, oh, we may have a health problem. It was actually designated as a tier 1 national security risk. And the same thing in 2015 as well. Again, public health, disease, particularly pandemic, emerging infectious diseases and growing antimicrobial resistance. These were all listed there in that government document. And then in 2018, just 2 years ago, Theresa May's government published a biological security strategy, which stated that significant outbreaks of disease are among the highest impact risks faced by the UK. And the purpose of the strategy was to draw together the work taking place across government departments to protect the UK from such risk. So they knew about it. They knew it was a high risk. They'd been going on about it being a high risk and getting prepared for years. So what went wrong? And in my opinion, you don't have to look too far for the answer, because in the same national security strategies, nuclear threats, nuclear weapon threats, were relegated to tier 2 threats. So you had pandemic up here, nuclear weapons threats down here. So why was it that tier 1 threats, pandemic, were massively underfunded? In fact, they were cut for a decade, the health service and so on. And the tier 2 threat was allocated £205 billion. You know, this is just shows the absurdity of our government's policies and the priorities and what it spent the public's money on. You know, they have this idea that Britain needs nuclear weapons for its status in the world, and we have to have nuclear weapons in order to be a heavy hitter. You know, what has it done for our status in the world that we are the second highest number of deaths from coronavirus? You know, that we've got the highest death toll in Europe. Does that make us look like a kind of very powerful country that everyone should respect and look up to? I don't think it does. It makes us look completely unprepared, incapable of looking after its population, and so on. You know, what good are nuclear weapons now? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this. And to start winding up, Murad, this week, Parliament's Public Accounts Committee has actually accused the MOD of poor management of the Trident replacement project, leading to over £1 billion extra cost to the taxpayer, and that the cost may well continue to rise. So it's not enough that they've allocated 205 billion and they're starting spending it. They're already overspending because of their incompetence. You know, I mean, you couldn't make it up. So there's no case for having nuclear weapons or building them. It's a massive waste of money. It makes us a target, puts us at increased risk, and this has to stop. And I think, to conclude, the experience of the last couple of months shows that the argument that we've heard sometimes, even in the movement, that you need to keep nukes in order to keep jobs, is completely wrong. And arms conversion has been taking place at the demand of the government over the past week. So Barrow, where they make the nuclear subs, that's been making health equipment, visors and so on for NHS staff to wear. The UK Ventilator Challenge Consortium, which includes arms manufacturers as well as nuclear weapons producers, they've been making ventilators instead. So all over the years when the government said it's completely utopian fantasy, we're not going to convert arms into something socially useful, well, now it's been happening at the demand of the government. So let's make sure that after the crisis, this is made into a permanent change, that the government's priorities are organised and paid for in the interests of the people as a whole. Thanks very much, Murad.
Thank you very much, Kate. Indeed there. I think you importantly raised how any spending that we may be required to deal with this pandemic crisis is dwarfed by the military expenditure that we have already and forthcoming. And I think that needs to be highlighted from the outset. And I also do agree, the FT has probably given the best coverage on the pandemic, not only here in the United Kingdom, but globally. Can I now ask our next speaker to join us? She's an anti-austerity campaigner in London and an NHS doctor working in mental health, Mona Kamal. Thank you, Mona. The floor's yours.
Apologies, I always forget to unmute. But yeah, thank you so much, Murad, and thank you to Stop the War for inviting me to speak today. I think these online meetings have just become so important to enable us to come together and to make sense collectively of the scale of this crisis, so we don't get overwhelmed by it, because this is really an extraordinary situation. And we also need to be making sense of why it is that we are struggling to manage it, certainly more than almost any other country in the world. It's easy to forget when we talk about having the highest death toll in Europe, or we hear the growing numbers day after day of those who've lost their lives, that, you know, these are human beings with loved ones and families that will be grieving them. And I think we owe it to them to really understand how we arrived here and why it is in the 7th richest country in the world, and with a health service that as recently as 2011 was lauded the best in the world by the Commonwealth Foundation. We have failed to deal safely and effectively with this pandemic. And over the course of the last decade, certainly since the 1980s actually, but especially in the last decade, we've seen both the withdrawal of funding from the NHS, but also accelerated privatisation at unprecedented levels. Coalition government and then the Conservative government austerity spending, they saw the longest sustained reduction in healthcare spending in the NHS's history as a percentage of GDP. And then on top of that, we have the fragmenting of the service, with the more lucrative bits being kind of split off and sold off to the private sector. And, you know, what we've also seen is that those individuals who are Tory MPs who are coming out and clapping for us every week, they've also been engaged in attacking healthcare workers and students every which way, and attacking their, working conditions. We saw the scrapping of the NHS student bursary, attacks on the junior doctors contract, a 14% real terms cut for nurses. So in every possible way, they have been undermining the NHS in the last 10 years. So I think it's fair to say that in the lead up to this pandemic, the NHS has been set up to fail by this government through deliberate under-resourcing and privatisation. And it was made to deal with the worst public health crisis that this country's ever faced, at a moment when the NHS was arguably at its very weakest. NHS staff who knew the extent to which the service had been struggling to meet just basic demands well before this pandemic hit, they knew that the service would struggle to cope. And we are seeing that now. We're seeing the impact of this downgrading of the NHS being played out in the most tragic way in our mortality figures. And whether it's the demand for ICU beds, the logistical demands for to enable testing in the way that Germany and South Korea have been able to test, or the demands for procurement of protective equipment, we've just not been able to meet those demands. And what this has done is make it undeniably clear for us, like, where our government's priorities lie. That they've prioritised pumping limitless resources into certain areas, so corporate subsidies, tax breaks for the wealthiest, and of course the renewing of Trident and the fighting of perpetual cycle of needless wars to further imperial ambitions. So all of those areas there's been no scrimping whatsoever. Meanwhile, the NHS was left to deal, it was left so crippled that we're in a situation where charity fundraising to keep it going is suddenly an acceptable norm that we should all be celebrating. And of course, running alongside this, we had a propaganda campaign to convince us that we couldn't afford our public services, we couldn't afford the NHS, and also the scapegoating of migrants and health tourists as the reason why the NHS was overstretched and failing. So we know now, for example, that unlike defence spending, pandemic planning was one of the main casualties of austerity. In 2016, we had the pandemics drill, Operation Cygnus, the buried results of which revealed that the NHS had been under-resourced to a dangerous level, meaning that 45% of emergency stockpiles were wiped out. And these stockpiles include the personal protective equipment that we're all crying out for. So the reason NHS England has not been able to provide NHS staff and keep them safe is because during austerity, £325 million worth of emergency supplies were just wiped off. And staff have been warning about the lack of PPE now for 6 weeks. And yet 48% of doctors, that's almost half of doctors, are saying that they are doing high-risk procedures without access to the full sleeve protective gown. And 38% are saying that they're doing these procedures without protective equipment for their eyes. Meaning that staff are having to purchase their own or, fashion aprons from bin bags. And then there was a leaked government report telling us that we need to rewash the PPE and reuse it. NHS staff are making the ultimate sacrifice with their own lives, but also the lives of their loved ones as well. And the responsibility for this lies with a government which has just failed to protect us. We have the figure of 217 NHS workers who've passed away, but what we're not hearing is the fact that, staff are becoming exposed to patients with the virus, not being tested, and then taking the virus home to their loved ones who might be from at-risk groups. This is happening to our colleagues and we're not hearing about it. A nurse who I know in a nearby trust to where I work developed mild symptoms himself, but his wife, who'd been isolating at home, caught the virus and sadly passed away after a period in ITU, and he wasn't even able to say goodbye to her. He had to say goodbye to her via Skype. If you're an NHS worker working in close proximity with patients, we should be expecting to get tested before we go home to our loved ones regularly, and that's just simply not happening. And also we've lost, a record number of beds, meaning that intensive care colleagues are becoming more and more strict about who it is that they will be offering ventilation to. So they're having to deny intensive care treatment to patients purely because of capacity issues and not having the right number of staff to be able to provide that service. We came into this crisis with the lowest number of beds per capita of almost any other European country. This is exactly what we need to be holding our government to account for, because it is because of their mismanagement of the service that is now being manifested in our mortality figures. And I think we need to also focus on the question of hostile environment in the NHS and also against NHS staff. We have to recognise the price that BAME staff in particular are paying during this crisis. We've seen already that the likelihood of becoming more critically ill, the likelihood of catching the virus, and then the likelihood of dying from it are all worse if you are from a Black and ethnic minority background. And there are, a lot of reasons for this. A third of all patients lying in intensive care units right now are from a BAME background. And if you are, and this disparity exists within NHS staff as well. So this is a moment that we have to be demanding the end of the hostile environment in the NHS. NHS staff, it can't be overstated that the NHS is held up by migrants and BAME staff, and more than half of the NHS staff who've died from this virus were born abroad. You know, and these are individuals who've come to this country, who've faced all the hardship and disadvantage that comes with migration and scapegoating by this government, all the while providing genuine, important services to their communities, and then they are expected to pay. They're expected to pay to access the NHS for themselves and their families. So scrapping the NHS surcharge, that's the £624 that people have to pay if they don't have recourse to public funds every year, has to be scrapped. That's a really simple, straightforward demand that we can be making. You know, families are falling into debt because of this surcharge. And, you know, the information about immigrants who are coming as patients to NHS trusts, that information now the NHS trust is required to forward to the Home Office. There is no way that patient information should be used in this way. And I think I've been thinking a lot about what the government's suggestion of herd immunity and, you know, what that reveals about how they view us. You know, the fact that our Prime Minister can sit on breakfast television and talk really casually about allowing a disease with 3% mortality to move through the population, you know, or that the chief scientific officer says that we need 60% of the population to get infected to achieve herd immunity, is a really clear, unmistakable message that they see some of us as expendable. You know, by lifting the lockdown last Sunday and sending certain groups back to work, what they've essentially done is decide that there are some lives that are valuable and there are other lives that are worth less than keeping the machinery of profit making going. You know, and this is very similar. This, you know, certain lives are worth less than others, and this callousness that they're showing to working people in this country now is very similar to the callousness with which they treat ordinary people in those parts of the world where we've been involved in military invasions, whether it's Iraq or Libya or Yemen, or whether it's migrants and refugees that they're allowing to drown in the Mediterranean. You know, they are treating some of us in that exact same way. You know, the way they treat those lives is expendable. You know, and you know, this is precisely why our solidarity and our sense of community can never just stop at our borders or the borders of Europe. I think this is a really important lesson in revealing to us their level of disregard for their lives of working people in this country, but also, you know, it's something we must never collude with, whether it's working people offering solidarity to people in this country, but also, you know, in all other parts of the world. And I think that's something I hope we can carry forwards with us on the other side of this, to drive our demand for an end to, you know, needless perpetual cycles of war, and also an end to the hostile environment. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona, for telling us what it's like on the front line in the NHS, and reminding us in many ways the NHS was set up to fail by the present government with the protracted cuts and privatisation. And it's deeply ironic now that we have many ministers clapping on a Thursday night. And let's see, and that's certainly something we've got to fight for in the immediate future, to make sure the financing of the NHS is sacrosanct and solidly put in place for its safety, not only of the staff, but all of us in the UK. Now, just before I move on to our next speaker, can I just remind people, if you want to put questions in, please do it through the chat lines, the chat line that you have in the Zoom setup. That's the best way of getting questions through to us. We've got some already, and I'm sure some have occurred already since we've had our first two speakers speaking. Our next speaker has produced two films recently, The Dirty War on the NHS and The Coming War in China. So there are few people in the world who are better placed to contextualise the current crisis than John Pilger. John, the floor's yours.
Thank you, and thank you to Stop the War for arranging this very important discussion, and thank you to Mona and Kate for some really excellent views. I was particularly struck when Mona mentioned Johnson going on breakfast television to talk about herd immunity and how it's okay that a disease with this infection rate, for it to sweep through the community. And as she rightly said, the inference of that was that some people in the community are expendable. And I think that's what this is really about. I mean, what we're talking tonight really is the war on healthcare and the war on peace. They're both connected. The same people who are undermining the health service, who've done everything that Mona has so graphically described and Kate has described, are the same people who caused 1 million deaths in Iraq. They're the same people who destroyed Libya. They're the same people who have supported sanctions on up to 1/4 of the nations of the world. They're the same people who are locked in to the Trump administration and to American so-called foreign policy. I think what we have to really understand, it has to be our headline, is who's the enemy here? Who is our enemy? Who is the enemy of peace? Who is the enemy of healthcare? 10,000 people die every year for want of public health care. Healthcare has become a lucrative business in the same way that arms are a lucrative business. Healthcare is described as the new oil. And what the Tories have done and what the Blair government has done, the Blairites have done, since the 1980s, is to turn the National Health Service, which as Mona rightly described, was, and I say was, probably was, a visionary health service, one that supplied health provision in a way that, as an institution, that few countries could say. But what they've done is they've turned it into a resource for their own profit. And that's still going on. This extraordinary health secretary, Matt Hancock, who should have been sacked, along with Simon Stevens and so many others, they all represent a Trojan horse within the health service. Hancock's latest ruse, if you could call it that, is to develop what he calls a COVID digital storehouse. And he's sold off, effectively, it's the greatest data sell-off in history of all our medical records, our personal medical records, our sensitive medical records. He's sold them to Google. He's sold them to firms like Palantir, which was started by Peter Thiel, who is a Trump ally and was deeply involved with the CIA's war in Afghanistan and Iraq. He sold them to companies, a British company like Faculty, which was founded by Ben Warner, who ran the data operations on the Vote Leave campaign. So it's a free-for-all. Even as people are dying, even as frontline NHS workers are still at risk, those who are running the health service are betraying it. Another one is contracts for tracking and tracing. Such an important thing. The very thing that the government didn't do was to track, trace, and isolate, or track, trace, and quarantine right from the beginning which other countries did so successfully, they've now sold this to Serco. Serco, of all companies. Serco is the company that took over GP services in Cornwall and stripped it of out-of-hours GP provision. The much ballyhooed Excel Centre, the Nightingale Hospital, was set up by KPMG, a management consultant. Just a few years ago, we had the only study about management consultants in the NHS, which found that every time the management consultants like McKinsey, KPMG, and all the rest of them go into the health service, they waste our money. Nothing improves. Inefficiency increases. So what we're seeing is that these enemies of the health service, and the enemies, it's an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? But the enemies of the health service are the current health secretary, the last health secretary, Jeremy Hunt, who was responsible for getting rid of 40% of the PPE equipment while he was health secretary, and goes right back to Andrew Lansley, who was the architect of the Health and Social Care Act, which opened up the health service to exploitation by the likes of Serco, GS4, they're back to now, Richard Branson's Virgin Care, and the rest. In other words, the methodical destruction of a visionary health service. Not only that, in 2016, Jeremy Hunt, when he was health secretary, presided over an extraordinary drill of a pandemic in Britain, which when you read it and take out the words coronavirus, reads very much like today. They actually got it right. It was called Operation Cygnus. And what it proved was that the health service was overwhelmed. There wasn't enough PPE. There weren't enough ventilators. There weren't enough ICUs. There weren't enough frontline clinical staff in the right places at the right time. The health service which had been starved through all the years since 2010, since the Health and Social Care Act was enacted, was on its knees. And what did they do about this? This is a warning 4 years ago. What they did about it was they covered it up. The conclusions of this report were never made public. And if you go onto the website now of the NHS, or just try to find it, go through all the official channels to try and find some information about this extraordinary operation, you won't find anything. They covered it up. Now, the same thing if you go through FOI and try and find it, you won't find it. In the same way that FOI, Freedom of Information, which is the right of everybody to find out about the decisions made by their governments and vested interests. You won't find out about how the Johnson government with Hancock is handing out these lucrative contracts right now to companies like Serco, GS4, Google, and all the rest of it. So I think what we've got to understand is the degree of ruthlessness, of those who are the enemies of public health. And that is this government in Britain. It most certainly is the Trump government. The Italian government has done a pretty good job of showing themselves to be that too. They were running, one of the reasons they had Lombardy, they had so much of a disaster there, was that they were in the thick of private-public partnerships, and they were having hospitals compete against each other. Does that sound familiar? Just like the NHS. In other words, just as countries have been attacked all over the world, so healthcare, because it represents a gold mine, healthcare has been attacked. Public healthcare has been attacked and denied to so many people everywhere. And it's that we have to realize, because until we oppose that, and I have to say in Britain at the moment, there is no effective political opposition to that. None. None whatsoever. Sir Keir Starmer can nod and agree with the Prime Minister and then throw in a few QC questions. That's not opposition. There should be an absolute movement, as there has been, defending the NHS, of which Mona has been such an important participant. That's what we need. We also have to ask about the nature of the lockdown. That's a vexed question, because all of us want to stop the progression of this disease, but at the same time, the lockdown immobilizes us. It means we can't protest. It means that we can't get out and gather and go to their doors and say, you're responsible for this. We have to consider that. That's part of the crisis, this crisis that we need to understand. I mean, it's being exploited. Winston Churchill said, never waste a good crisis. I can assure you that his successors in this establishment in Britain are not wasting this crisis. That we will see coming out of this, unless we're vigilant, we will see an even further stripped down health service, and we will see all the traits of authoritarianism that many of us have been trying to make signs about. Unless we're very, very careful, we have to confront that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that contribution. And you're right, sometimes disasters as there is at present have been used by British governments, and we only have to look at what happened in the last financial crisis, when on the back of bailing out the banks, austerity was imposed on the public services. So thanks for reminding us, and that's what often happens when governments are trying to manage disasters and they justify things on the back of it. Now, we're going to go to the questioning now. We've got, what's the time now? It's 1:45. I want to make sure John gets into bed promptly, because it's pretty late in Australia. We've had a few questions in, keep them in. And the first question I'm going to, and I hope the panelists can hear me, is Ron from Bristol. He says, what lessons can we draw from the government's mishandling of the pandemic, and what can we do to translate these lessons into policy changes? Shall I repeat the question?
No, I've got it.
Got it. Okay. Mona, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question going forward, because what we know, at the moment, the attention is on NHS and its staff, and, people are coming out on their doorsteps and clapping. But what we know from the Conservative government is that there's every indication now, from Rishi Sunak's announcements earlier this week, that they will be looking to public services to help plug the gaps of the economic fallout and the recession that's going to be the likely result of this pandemic. And we need to be demanding that we are not paying for this crisis with yet more austerity cuts. And it's not those with the very least that will have to foot the bill. I think the other important things that we need to be looking at, I spoke about the hostile environment and ending the NHS surcharge, which is a really important sort of basic demand, because there are families who are, you know, falling into debt because of this, or are just failing to present to NHS services for treatment altogether because they're too frightened. I think we need to be asking why it is we lost 17,000, you know, beds, record number of beds lost in 10 years, and you know, reinvest in that. We need to be supporting the campaigns in defence of our NHS workers in meaningful, practical ways. So that means supporting the campaigns to reinstate the NHS student bursary. You know, we've had a massive reduction in the number of individuals applying to become nurses and healthcare professionals because of the scrapping of this bursary. I relied on that bursary when I was a medical student. So we need to have that reinstated. We need to get behind the NHS reinstatement bill, which will essentially renationalise the NHS, because we don't have a national health service anymore. It's been broken up and fragmented into lots of small businesses, essentially. And it's that lack of cohesion, actually, which has made dealing with this crisis so challenging. So we need to renationalise the health service with the NHS reinstatement bill. We need to be getting behind the campaigns to support our nurses in meaningful ways. It's not enough for us to just be clapping for them if they are also having to go to food banks and rely on food banks because of the fact they've suffered a real terms pay cut of 14% in the last 10 years. So there are actually some really important, meaningful, material ways in which that we can be supporting the NHS and its healthcare staff. Above all, it's demanding that we are not paying for the economic fallout of this pandemic with yet more cuts and austerity to our public services. That's crucial, because it looks like they're coming for the NHS and NHS staff.
Okay, well, thank you, Mona. Kate, John, do you want to contribute to that?
Yeah, can I just chuck something in there? I mean, I think that was a very good point. Yeah, I think that was a very good point about the lack of cohesion. And to go back to my point, you know, the government has identified what are our security threats, but it doesn't spend on those security threats. It spends on other stuff, which is, you know, to do with vested interests of the arms companies and so on. But they do have what they call an integrated review coming up later this year, which is a review of defence and security strategies and so on. It was supposed to happen earlier this year, but it's been put on hold and delayed to later because of the pandemic. And this is a very good opportunity for organisations and campaigns to make submissions to the MOD and to the FCO to the integrated review. And somebody else mentioned, you know, putting pressure on the Labour Party. They have to act as an effective opposition, not kind of cheerleading with a few criticisms around the side. So they need to be saying the government has to relook at the security priorities for this country, because sure as anything, spending billions on nuclear weapons is not making us more secure. It has to go to meet those new threats like the pandemic, but also climate change as well. I mean, think back to earlier this year, the terrible threats people faced as a result of flooding, you know, again, a result of a disastrous situation. That can be addressed with the proper effective use of national resources.
Thank you, Kate. John, do you want to come back on that question? What lessons can we do? Okay, John.
Yeah, I'm sorry you can't see me, but I'm having phones problem, and my Wi-Fi only lasts a certain time, but here I am. Look, I think what Mona said is right about the health service, renationalising it. It has to be, I mean, renationalised. It has to be taken back again. The scaffolding, more than the scaffolding of what it was, a visionary health service, is there. The people, of course, are extraordinary. But that has to be taken. They're not ours. It's not in public ownership. It's controlled by the likes of of zealous Thatcherites and Blairites like Hancock and Johnson and others, by deeply cynical people. We have to take that back. Now, how do we do that? Well, perhaps Kate and I might disagree here. I don't think it's about submissions to the MOD. I think it is about a movement. And as soon as this lockdown is over, there has to be a mass movement with people going into the streets, going to the front doors of power, with all the experience that they've had over the last several months. And many of them have had the most terrible experience, such as those families with 40% of the nation's impoverished children, others with difficult problems of violence, others who have simply felt that they've been under house arrest. If you like, that almost negative energy has to be turned into a movement to take back the health service and change the whole nature of politics. I think we've had it, certainly in my lifetime, with the Labour Party. We don't have an opposition in Britain. We have movements of people. That is the potential. And if we go back into that, the idea that in Keir Starmer's Labour Party we can find some kind of solution, then I think we're very gravely mistaken. But it has to be a people's movement that joins up all the dots that Kate and Mona have spoken about the fact that Trident is going ahead as we speak. Attacks on Yemen by British aircraft using British bombs. Now, wasn't there a court decision last year that prevented Britain from bombing Yemen? Oh, yes, there was. But there's loopholes, of course, and or rather of supplying the Saudis, I beg your pardon, of supplying the Saudis with military equipment. But there are loopholes, and these loopholes include things called open licenses, which allow the export of an unlimited number of arms consignments over a fixed period, 3 to 5 years. So that horror in Yemen is going on. Britain is playing its role as number 2 imperial power in the world, while its own people, the British government is, while its own people are having to suffer well, for people who've, of course, families who've lost people, who are having to grieve people who shouldn't have died, the thousands who have died in this country due to coronavirus. Many of those people should be alive today if politically this government had acted as other governments had acted. And you can tick them off: South Korea, Germany, Vietnam, one of the poorest countries in the world. If it had acted in that way, in other words, if it had had the welfare of its people at heart, well, it doesn't. And I suppose the sum of what I'm saying is that we have to recognize something that's rather cold and hard. And if you doubt that, watch the performance of Jeremy Hunt, the last health secretary. Watch his performance as he changed seamlessly to be foreign secretary. Imposing austerity, cutting back bed capacity in the health service in one post, and then in his next post, imposing a kind of an American world, because that's what it is, an American world on so many countries in the world. look at him when he look at his statements when he spoke about Julian Assange, when he deceived people in terms of what Assange faced. Now, this is a man who occupied both positions in the government that effectively is still in power. That's something that we have to confront. That, as I mentioned earlier, that degree of ruthlessness is something we have to understand.
Well, thank you, John. Now, just before we move to our next question, John has actually reminded me I should tell you about our next session, which is on the 6th of June, which is on the coronavirus, war and empire. Arundhati Roy, Jeremy Corbyn, both in conversation with Tariq Ali. That's on the 6th of June. I hope after this session, you can all find yourself booking yourself for that session as well. Now, returning to this session, the next question is from Tim Carey, and he asks, how far, if at all, does the panel feel global lockdown is a pretext for erosion of civil and democratic rights across the world? I'll repeat the question. How far, if at all, does the panel feel global lockdown is a pretext for the erosion of civil and democratic rights across the world? Kate, I know you've been doing some stuff on this, so can I ask you to make the first contribution?
Yes, well, I don't think that it's a pretext, because I think that actually the lockdown is what we require, and the failure to have a lockdown earlier has actually led to many more deaths, as we've seen, and so on, and the kind of premature ending of the lockdown for financial reasons and for profit reasons acts against our interests. Having said that, it's absolutely the case that big attacks on our civil liberties or curtailment of our civil liberties are being enacted, and there is a danger that they will be maintained longer than is necessary. You know, the kind of rights and so on under the emergency legislation that the military's been given, the police forces have been given, and so on. So we need to see those rolled back absolutely wholly and urgently when the pandemic threat is over. And I've actually put into chat a bit earlier on how at the end of last month, the MOD had introduced a ban on its staff up in, well, in particularly in Faslane in Scotland. I know there's some people on the line now living up there in Glasgow and in Scotland near the Faslane naval base where the nuclear weapons are. They are banned. The staff there are banned from either talking about Trident and Trident replacement. They're banned from talking about Scotland and defence in Scotland, and they're banned from talking about spending reviews. You know, so those kind of curtailments of the right to freedom of speech, that has to end. So I don't think it was a pretext. I think the lockdown's necessary, but we cannot allow that necessary lockdown to be an excuse for the infringement of our rights and liberties.
Thank you, Kate. I know Mona wants to come in on this one as well before I go to John. Mona?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I think this is a really important point. I work in mental health, I'm a psychiatrist, and I think the Coronavirus Act, which was rushed through Parliament a couple of weeks ago, has seen some what it's done is effectively increase the level of restrictiveness that psychiatrists and mental health services can enforce on patients. So what we call sectioning patients, for example, detaining them against their will, which is something that we know is hugely racialized. You know, you're 4 times more likely to be sectioned if you are from a BAME background or Black African background than white counterparts. And I think what this Coronavirus Act has done has just, as I say, it's increased the more restrictive aspects of the Mental Health Act and has stripped away measures in the Act that are there to safeguard patients from inappropriate detention or other restrictive practices. So I think this is something that we really need to be alert to. What else is in the Coronavirus Act that we need to be scrutinising to ensure that any rights that we've lost necessarily perhaps lost during this period are not something that are then not reversed. I think that's really important. That's what I wanted to mention for that one.
Thank you, Mona. And we shouldn't just leave it to our parliamentarians. John, our loss of civil.
I think the Coronavirus Act, getting back our rights. Well, how are we going to get back the health service? Because under cover of the Coronavirus Act, this emergency legislation, and everything that came with it, yes, a lockdown may well have been absolutely necessary, but it was done without, and I repeat, without all the other necessary elements, such as tracking, tracing, quarantining groups, as I mentioned at the beginning, all those things that successful countries did. Instead, policy was changed from the ill-starred herd immunity straight over to lockdown, with the kind of modeling coming from Imperial College that has become, frankly, a laughingstock around the world. But so, yes, what are the rights we get back? I would think the right to our health service. I mean, what this legislation has allowed is for Health Secretary Matt Hancock and his technocrats to accelerate the destruction of state healthcare and bring in more privatization. These people are zealots. I can't repeat this more with greater emphasis. Hancock himself was caught promoting a tech company, Babylon, in an advertorial in the Evening Standard. In one part of this advertorial, there was a section called Matt's Apps. Well, the app that we're being asked to put on our phones is also an instrument of mass surveillance. What will happen to that? But I think the central question is, it's not so much what rights can we walk outside our front doors again? Can families meet each other again? Is, well, do we get a public health service back? Because this whole emergency has been used to further privatize and sell off the health service, which is the basic reason for the problem, the trouble we're in. It's the reason that there was a shortage of PPE. It's a reason there was a shortage of ICU. There's a reason that the NHS ended up with the lowest bed capacity in Europe. That has been accelerated. How do we get that back? That's the question. That's a political question, and that has to be confronted.
Okay, if we just take one final question, which I think it comes to the nub of what we've been discussing for the last hour or so. It's from Brendan O'Brien. There is talk of further austerity ahead to pay for the losses incurred due to COVID-19. What can we do to get nuclear weapons and warfare budgets on the table? I'll start with Kate again. I'll go to Mona and then John, if that's okay. Kate?
Yes, well, I'm going to argue for working across all levels and layers of society. I know John responded negatively to me saying, you know, try and input into the government debates about it and build the movement. Well, absolutely, we have to build the movement. You know, we've spent the last decades building the peace and anti-war movement, particularly since 9/11 and the war against Iraq, you know, but I think we also have to do everything we can at absolutely every layer and level of society, across civil society. There are many people organised in faith communities that are very active for peace and against nuclear weapons and war. There's an increasing number of people engaged around combating arms fairs. For example, at Excel last year, we had a much greater level of participation there, and people like the Mayor of London, Mayor of Newham speaking out against the arms fair and so on. So there are many ways in which we can work. And although I'm not a Labour Party member myself, and I don't think it's like a silver bullet or anything like that, but nevertheless, there are many people active and involved in the Labour Party who share the same views as ours. And if they want that to be their arena of struggle, they are right to go ahead and do that and to try and change Labour Party policies on this. Because Labour is still pro-Trident replacement. That has to change. We have to work with other parties that share the same agenda as us. We need to work across parties and without parties. We need to build the movement and the understanding in the trade union movement as well. So I mentioned earlier about the misunderstanding about jobs, retaining nuclear weapons in order to have the jobs. We need to win that argument now, that is absolutely unnecessary. We've seen arms conversion as a result of the pandemic. That can go forward. So we need to be fighting on every front, in every way, and there's nothing that should be left out. If people want to lobby the government and make submissions, they should do that. If they want to be at the bases taking non-violent direct action, they should be doing that. We all need to be active, and I believe very strongly that there is a window of opportunity as a result of this pandemic, because we've all seen whose jobs matter, whose work matters in society, really, and we know who it is. We know it's not the hedge fund managers and the advertising managers and the bosses and the directors and all that sort of thing. Their work does not matter. It's the work of the NHS and the road sweepers and the cleaners and the care workers and the delivery workers and the supermarket workers. That it's their work that matters. And we need to get a shift in values in our society as a result of this. And I think the door will be open for a short period to bring about change. So we need to have a really powerful surge of demand for change as a result of this pandemic. And we need to do it together. Thanks, Murad.
Thank you, Kate. Mona.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think this is a really extraordinary moment where people's ideas are changing. There's so much that's happening at the moment, and as Kate says, our priorities and our understanding of what it is that is essential is being completely realigned. And what needs to come out of that is, the bringing together of a whole new social contract. And I think the mass movements are going to be absolutely crucial in this. Of course, there's no question. I think we can say that our hope cannot lie with the Labour Party anymore. Perhaps in the last few years there was that rare window where we could look to the Labour Party to enact the kind of changes that we want, but that's past. It has to be around building the mass movements, movements like People's Assembly Against Austerity, movements like Stop the War Coalition, for example, which I would urge people to join. That's really where the focus has to be now. And I think for the time being, just looking in the short term, our focus has to be in supporting the National Education Union, because really that's where the fight is now, to ensure that we do not lift the lockdown prematurely. They are the roadblock to the government's plans to lift the lockdown. Any lifting of the lockdown now, before we have the proper systems in place of test, track, isolate, and contact trace, and any attempt to lift the lockdown before that stuff is in place is a return to herd immunity, and we absolutely can't accept that. So we need to get behind the NEU right now, like our lives depended on it. I'll finish it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona, to mentioning what's happening with our schools, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. You're right to mention that. And finally, John, your final thoughts before the evening ends in Down Under.
Yeah. This has to be a moment of enlightenment, doesn't it? They used to call it a raising of consciousness. If it isn't, then people will have suffered in vain. It has to be. Because unless there is a change, if we go back to the old ways, where is that going to take us? We have no right to ask people to go up the same cul-de-sacs. we have no right to ask them to knock on doors that never open. There now has to be what I would call a sort of galvanized anger, an anger first at all those thousands of people who have died unnecessarily from this virus, because the very thing that Mona has just described, that of testing, tracking, isolating, was never brought in Britain. And what was brought in was something that was done crudely, at the last moment, and ruthlessly. So I think all the questions that we've raised here tonight are very pertinent, but the overall question is how. How do we do it? It's no good saying that we know the problems, we know what's needed in the health service. We know that there is a war going on against most of humanity. Most of the members of the United Nations have what are known as sanctions clamped on them. These are acts of war. We have a possible coming war against China, where China is now developing the most fearsome weapons in order to defend itself against a rampant United States. And the United States is rampant. Perhaps it always has been, but never more so than at the moment. These are big issues of war and peace and our health, and we have to think about them and how we combat them. But there's no question we have to combat them.
Thank you very much, John, for that contribution, along with the rest of our panelists, Kate and Mona. I'm sure all those who have been listening would love to thank, for me to thank you dearly for your comments and contributions. Now, before everyone goes, can I just plug two things? Our 6th of June session again, Coronavirus, War and Empire, where we'll have not only Jeremy Corbyn, but Arundhati Roy speaking in conversation with Tariq Ali. And finally, if there's one way you can contribute to having more of these stimulating sessions with guests from all over the world, please join Stop the War Coalition. You can go to our website or our Facebook page and do join up, because that's where we need to be, a mass membership organisation lobbying and defending the NHS, as well as keeping an eye on the military activities of the British state around the world. Thank you very much for all joining us this afternoon, and I hope you have a good day. And John, I hope you have a good night's kip, and I'll see you around, Kate and Mona. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks very
Thank
much,
you.
Murad. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.